I still remember the exact moment my world crumbled. It was a Tuesday morning, October 15th, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, trying to pay our monthly bills. The coffee was still steaming in my favorite mug, the one with "World's Best Wife," that my husband Marcus had given me for our 5th anniversary. How ironic that phrase would become. When I logged into our joint checking account, I expected to see the usual balance of around $12,000. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Marcus worked as a regional sales manager, and I ran a small online boutique selling handmade jewelry. We had built this life together brick by brick over 8 years of marriage. But the screen showed something that made my blood run cold. $247.83. That was all that remained of our life savings, our emergency fund, our security. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the transaction history. 3 massive withdrawals had been made in the past week, each one authorized by Marcus. The largest was $8,500, withdrawn on Friday afternoon while I was at my sister's baby shower. I called the bank immediately, my voice trembling as I spoke to the representative. "There must be some mistake," I kept saying. But there was no mistake. The withdrawals were legitimate, made with Marcus's debit card and PIN. The representative confirmed that the money had been withdrawn from 3 different ATMs across town, in areas I'd never even been to. My mind raced through possibilities. Had Marcus been robbed? Was he in some kind of trouble? Maybe he was planning a surprise. Though what kind of surprise requires emptying our life savings? I tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried his office, but his assistant said he'd called in sick and wouldn't be back until Monday. That's when I noticed something else strange. Marcus's laptop was gone from his home office. His overnight bag was missing from our closet. And most telling of all, the framed photo of us from our honeymoon in Santorini, the one he kept on his nightstand, was face down. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, calling Marcus repeatedly, each call going to voicemail. I even drove to his favorite coffee shop, the gym where he worked out, and his friend Jake's house. Nobody had seen him. As evening approached, I realized I had to face the truth I'd been avoiding all day. Marcus hadn't been robbed. He hadn't been kidnapped. He had taken our money and disappeared. That night, I sat in our empty house, surrounded by the life we'd built together, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. I was going to find out what happened to my husband, to our money, and to our marriage. I was going to get answers, even if it meant discovering truths I wasn't prepared to face. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a betrayal so deep and calculated that it would change not just my life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of us could have anticipated. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of determination. The initial shock and devastation had crystallized into something sharper. A need for answers. I couldn't just sit there and wait for Marcus to explain himself. I had to take action. I started by going through everything Marcus had left behind with the precision of a detective. In his home office, I found bank statements he'd hidden in a locked drawer. Statements for an account I'd never known existed. The key was in his desk, taped under the bottom drawer. As I flipped through the papers, a pattern emerged that made my stomach drop. For the past 6 months, Marcus had been systematically moving money from our joint account to this secret account. Small amounts at first. $300 here, $500 there. Nothing I would notice in our day-to-day finances. But over time the amounts had grown larger. The final transfer, just 2 days before he cleaned out our account, was for $3,200. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the destination of the money. According to the statements, large sums had been transferred to an account belonging to someone named Isabella Rodriguez. The name meant nothing to me, but the frequency of the transfers told a story I didn't want to believe. I spent the next few hours cyberstalking Isabella Rodriguez. It didn't take long to find her social media profiles. She was beautiful in an obvious way. Long dark hair, perfect makeup, the kind of woman who posted gym selfies and inspirational quotes about living your best life. She worked as a marketing coordinator at a tech company downtown. As I scrolled through her Instagram, my heart sank further with each post. There were photos of expensive dinners at restaurants Marcus had told me he'd gone to for business meetings. Designer handbags that cost more than I made in a month. A weekend getaway to a luxury resort that coincided with a work conference Marcus had attended. And then I found the smoking gun. A photo from 3 weeks ago. Isabella was wearing a necklace I recognized. A vintage Art Deco piece that had belonged to my grandmother. Marcus had asked to borrow it for a client appreciation gift. I'd hesitated because of its sentimental value, but he'd assured me it was for an important female client who collected vintage jewelry. The caption read, "When your man knows exactly what you love #spoiled #blessed #love him." I screenshotted everything, my hands shaking with rage. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus hadn't just taken our money, he'd taken my family heirloom to give to his mistress. He'd been living a double life, funding his affair with the money we'd saved for our future. But I needed more than social media posts. I needed concrete proof. I drove to Isabella's workplace, parked across the street, and waited. I felt like a stalker, but I had to see them together with my own eyes. At 12:30 p.m. she emerged from the building. She was even more striking in person, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She walked confidently to a black BMW parked in the visitors section, a car I didn't recognize. And then the driver's door opened and Marcus stepped out. He looked different. Younger somehow, more vibrant than I'd seen him in months. He was wearing a new suit I'd never seen before, and his hair was styled differently. He walked around to Isabella's side, opened her door like a gentleman, and kissed her passionately in broad daylight. I watched them drive away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. This wasn't just an affair. It was a complete transformation. Marcus had become someone else entirely, someone who could afford expensive cars and designer clothes, someone who didn't care about being seen with his mistress in public. That evening I finally understood the scope of his betrayal. This wasn't impulsive or emotional. This was calculated, planned, and executed with the precision of a con artist. Marcus had been living a double life for months, systematically draining our accounts to fund his fantasy relationship. But what Marcus didn't know was that I had been building something too. My online jewelry business was more successful than I'd let on. I had my own accounts, my own investments, my own plans. And now I was going to use every resource at my disposal to make sure he faced the consequences of his choices. The game was just beginning, and Marcus had seriously underestimated his opponent. I spent the next 3 days in what I can only describe as strategic planning mode. I barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination. I had documented everything. The secret account, the transfers to Isabella, the photos of my grandmother's necklace, and most importantly, the evidence of Marcus's systematic theft from our joint account. But I needed more than evidence. I needed a plan that would ensure Marcus faced real consequences for his actions. I wasn't just going to file for divorce and split everything down the middle. He had stolen from me, lied to me, and humiliated me. I was going to make sure he understood the true cost of his betrayal. My first stop was my lawyer's office. Sarah Chin had handled the legal work when I started my business, and I trusted her completely. When I laid out everything I'd discovered, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This isn't just adultery, Emma," she said, reviewing the bank statements. "This is financial fraud. He moved money from joint accounts to fund his affair without your knowledge or consent. That's a criminal matter, not just a civil one." Sarah explained that I had several options. I could file for divorce on grounds of adultery and financial misconduct. I could press criminal charges for theft and fraud. Or I could do both. She recommended we move quickly to freeze all remaining joint assets and secure my business accounts. "There's something else," Sarah said, leaning forward. "If he's been this methodical about hiding money, there might be other accounts, other assets you don't know about. I recommend we hire a forensic accountant to dig deeper." That afternoon I met with David Park, a forensic accountant who specialized in divorce cases involving hidden assets. Within hours he had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Marcus hadn't just hidden one account, he'd hidden 3. He'd also taken out a credit card in both our names that I'd never seen, running up $15,000 in debt for what appeared to be luxury purchases. "Your husband has been planning this for a while," David explained. "He's been creating a parallel financial life, probably with the intention of eventually disappearing entirely. The good news is that everything he's done leaves a paper trail." But I wasn't satisfied with just recovering the money. I wanted Marcus to understand what it felt like to have your life turned upside down by someone you trusted. I wanted him to experience the same shock and betrayal he'd inflicted on me. That's when I remembered something crucial: Marcus's job. He was a regional sales manager for a Fortune 500 company, a position that required him to travel frequently and maintain relationships with high-value clients. His company had strict policies about personal conduct, especially regarding financial responsibility and moral character. I made copies of all the evidence, the bank statements, the photos, the credit card bills, everything. Then I requested a meeting with Marcus's supervisor, Robert Williams, under the pretense of planning a surprise for Marcus's upcoming work anniversary. Robert was a kind man in his 50s who had known Marcus for years. He welcomed me into his office with a warm smile, talking about what a valuable employee Marcus had been and how much the company appreciated his dedication. "I'm afraid I need to share some difficult information with you," I said, placing the folder on his desk. "Marcus has been using company time and resources to conduct an extramarital affair, and he's committed financial fraud to fund it." Robert's expression changed completely as he reviewed the evidence. Company policy was clear. Employees were expected to maintain high ethical standards, and financial crimes were grounds for immediate termination. Moreover, several of Marcus's business trips had actually been romantic getaways with Isabella, meaning he'd been defrauding the company as well. "I'll need to discuss this with HR and legal," Robert said quietly. "This is very serious, Emma. I'm so sorry you're going through this." By the end of that week, I had set everything in motion. The divorce papers were filed. The criminal complaint was submitted to the district attorney's office. All joint accounts were frozen. And Marcus's employer was conducting an internal investigation that would likely result in his termination. But I wasn't done. I had one more move to make, one that would ensure Marcus truly understood the consequences of his actions. I had discovered something about Isabella that she probably didn't want her employer to know, something that would make her question whether Marcus was worth the price she was about to pay. Marcus thought he was so clever, so careful in his deception. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated me. He had forgotten that I was the one who had built our life together, who had managed our finances, who had created systems and plans and backups for everything. Now he was about to learn that the quiet, trusting wife he'd betrayed was capable of strategic thinking that would make a chess master proud. Marcus finally called me on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after I discovered the empty bank account. I was in my kitchen drinking coffee from that same world's best wife mug, though now it felt like evidence of his mockery rather than his affection. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, his voice strained. "I know you've probably noticed some irregularities in our account." Irregularities. That's what he called stealing our life savings to fund his affair. I almost laughed at the audacity. "I've been wondering when you'd call," I replied calmly. "I've been quite busy this week. Look, I can explain everything. I'm going through some things right now and I know I should have talked to you first, but..." "Save it, Marcus. I know about Isabella." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear his mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much he could still lie about. "Emma, it's not what you think. She's just..." "She's just what?" "The woman you've been transferring thousands of dollars to? The woman wearing my grandmother's necklace in her Instagram posts? The woman you've been taking on romantic getaways with money from our emergency fund." Another silence. Longer this time. "I think I should come home so we can discuss this properly," he said finally. "That's not going to work for me, Marcus. You see, I've been busy this week. I've been talking to lawyers, forensic accountants, and some very interested parties about your recent activities." "What do you mean?" "I mean your supervisor Robert Williams was very concerned to learn about your creative expense reporting. And the district attorney's office found your systematic theft quite interesting from a criminal perspective." I heard him suck in a sharp breath. "You didn't." "I did. And Marcus? The joint accounts are frozen. The credit card you opened in both our names without my knowledge has been reported as fraud. And Isabella's employer received some very interesting information about their marketing coordinator's involvement in a criminal financial scheme." "Emma, please. You don't understand the whole situation." "I understand perfectly. You've been planning this for months, possibly years. You've been systematically stealing from our marriage to fund your fantasy life with another woman. You thought you were so clever, so careful. But you made one crucial mistake." "What mistake?" "You underestimated me." Over the next few days, I watched Marcus's carefully constructed double life collapse like a house of cards. His employer terminated him immediately after their investigation confirmed that he'd been falsifying expense reports and using company resources for personal affairs. The termination was for cause, meaning no severance, no benefits, and a permanent mark on his employment record. Isabella's situation was even more dramatic. It turned out that her company had strict policies about employees receiving unexplained large sums of money, especially from married men. The transfers Marcus had made to her account triggered an internal investigation into possible money laundering or other financial crimes. While she wasn't charged with anything criminal, her employer decided that her poor judgment made her unsuitable for a position requiring financial responsibility. But the most satisfying domino to fall was Marcus's credit rating. The forensic accountant had discovered that Marcus had been using our joint credit for cash advances to fund his affair. When I reported these as unauthorized transactions, the credit card companies launched their own investigations. Marcus's credit score plummeted, making it impossible for him to qualify for loans, credit cards, or even apartment rentals. The cherry on top came when Isabella's landlord discovered she could no longer afford her luxury apartment without her job. She was forced to move back in with her parents, taking Marcus with her. The man who had been playing the role of a sophisticated, successful businessman was now living in his mistress's childhood bedroom, unemployed and unemployable. But Marcus wasn't done fighting. He hired a lawyer, a cheap one since he couldn't afford anyone better, and tried to claim that I had entrapped him or that the evidence against him was somehow inadmissible. He demanded half of everything in the divorce, claiming that my business success was partly due to his emotional support during our marriage. His lawyer's demands were almost insulting. Marcus wanted half the value of my business, half our remaining assets, and alimony to support him while he rebuilt his career. He claimed that his affair was a symptom of our marital problems, not the cause of them, and that I bore some responsibility for driving him to seek companionship elsewhere. I had to admit, there was a certain twisted logic to his position. He had spent years watching my business grow while his own career stagnated. He had seen me become increasingly independent and successful while he remained stuck in the same job, making the same salary, living the same routine. But what Marcus didn't understand was that I had been documenting everything, not just his recent crimes but his behavior throughout our marriage. I had emails, text messages, and financial records that painted a picture of a man who had been planning his exit for much longer than anyone realized. And I had one final piece of evidence that would ensure Marcus got exactly what he deserved, and nothing more. The divorce proceedings were scheduled for a cold December morning, almost 2 months after I'd discovered Marcus's betrayal. I sat in the courtroom wearing my best suit, flanked by Sarah and David, with a folder thick with evidence that would determine the rest of my life. Marcus sat across the aisle with his budget lawyer, looking haggard and desperate. The past few months had not been kind to him. Without his job, his credit, or his ability to maintain the lifestyle he'd created with Isabella, he looked like a completely different person from the confident man who had kissed his mistress in broad daylight. Isabella wasn't there, of course. She had broken up with Marcus 3 weeks earlier, according to the private investigator I'd hired to monitor the situation. Apparently, an unemployed man living in his ex-mistress's parents' basement wasn't the exciting fantasy she'd signed up for. Judge Patricia Morrison was known for her no-nonsense approach to divorce cases, especially those involving financial misconduct. She reviewed the evidence methodically, asking pointed questions about the timeline of Marcus's theft and the extent of his deception. "Mr. Harrison," she said, addressing Marcus directly, "can you explain why you believed you had the right to unilaterally withdraw money from joint accounts without your wife's knowledge or consent?" Marcus's lawyer had prepared him for this question, but his answer was predictably weak. "Your Honor, I was under significant emotional stress due to problems in our marriage. I made poor decisions, but I never intended to permanently deprive my wife of these funds." "Where is the money now?" Judge Morrison asked. "Most of it has been spent, Your Honor. But I fully intend to repay every penny once I secure new employment." "And when might that be?" Marcus's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "My client is actively seeking employment, Your Honor, but the current economic climate makes finding suitable positions challenging." Judge Morrison turned to me. "Mrs. Harrison, you've provided extensive documentation of your husband's financial misconduct. Do you have any additional evidence you'd like to present?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I stood up and handed a final folder to the court clerk. Your Honor, I have one additional piece of evidence that I believe is relevant to the court's decision. The folder contained documents I'd discovered just 2 weeks earlier, hidden in Marcus's old laptop that he'd left at the house. It was a detailed plan, written in his own hand, outlining his strategy for leaving our marriage while maximizing his financial position. The plan was chilling in its calculation. Marcus had been documenting my business success, my work habits, and my financial strategies with the intention of claiming credit for my achievements in a divorce settlement. He had been planning to leave me for over a year, systematically moving money to hidden accounts while building a case for why he deserved half of everything I'd worked to build. But the most damning part of the plan was his timeline. Marcus had intended to wait until my business reached a certain value threshold before filing for divorce. He had calculated exactly how much money he could extract from our marriage while minimizing his own financial exposure. The affair with Isabella wasn't a crime of passion or a symptom of marital problems. It was part of his exit strategy, a way to establish an independent life before ending our marriage. He had been using our joint funds to set up his new life, planning to leave me with nothing but debt and devastation. Judge Morrison read through the documents with obvious disgust. Mr. Harrison, this appears to be a premeditated plan to defraud your wife of her assets while conducting an extramarital affair. Do you have any explanation for these documents? Marcus's face had gone completely white. He whispered something to his lawyer, who shook his head and shrugged helplessly. Your Honor, Marcus said finally, those documents they were just thoughts. I was confused and angry, and I wrote things down to help me process my emotions. I never intended to act on any of those plans. You never intended to act on them? Judge Morrison's voice was sharp. Mr. Harrison, you withdrew nearly $12,000 from joint accounts, transferred money to your mistress, and falsified expense reports to fund your affair. How is that not acting on these plans? The final judgment was everything I had hoped for and more. Marcus received nothing from our joint assets. He was ordered to repay every penny he had stolen with interest. He was also responsible for all the debt he had accumulated in both our names, including the secret credit card. Most importantly, he had no claim to my business or any of the assets I had accumulated independently. Judge Morrison ruled that Marcus's systematic theft and premeditated fraud disqualified him from any form of spousal support or equitable distribution. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the look on Marcus's face when he realized that his carefully calculated plan had backfired completely. He had spent months planning to leave me with nothing, and instead he was walking away with less than nothing. As we left the courthouse, Marcus approached me one last time. Emma, I know I messed up, but this is too much. You're destroying my life. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. This man who had shared my bed, my dreams, my bank account, had planned to systematically destroy my life while pretending to love me. He had stolen my money, my trust, and my grandmother's necklace to fund his fantasy with another woman. Marcus, I said quietly, I didn't destroy your life. I simply refused to let you destroy mine. 6 months later, I was thriving. My business had grown exponentially, partly because I was no longer supporting Marcus's secret lifestyle. I had moved to a beautiful apartment downtown, close to my studio and my clients. I had even started dating again. A kind, honest man who understood that trust was something to be earned, not assumed. Marcus, on the other hand, was still living with Isabella's parents, working part-time at a call center, and struggling to make his court-ordered payments. Isabella had moved on to someone else, someone with better financial prospects and fewer legal problems. The moral of my story isn't about revenge, though I'll admit there was some satisfaction in watching Marcus face the consequences of his choices. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to let anyone, even someone you love, treat you as less than you are. Marcus thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. He thought he was the master strategist while I was the trusting, naive wife. But what he failed to understand was that I had been building something real while he was building something based on lies and theft. In the end, the truth always wins. And sometimes, if you're patient and strategic enough, the truth wins spectacularly. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Document everything, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of someone who has been underestimated. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim and showing the world exactly who you really are. Marcus cleared our joint account thinking he was taking control of his life. What he didn't expect was that I would take control of mine.